Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, everybody, welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we celebrate story, we're obsessed with creativity, and my modest goal is just to find very fascinating people and talk to them to find out what makes them tick. I'm Sean Murphy. You can find out more about me at seanmurphy.net. If you've been following 1455 or anything that I've done, there's a familiar face on the screen right now, and it's because I talk to this person anytime the opportunity presents itself, and I'm delighted to say that I've had many similar conversations with her. Let me give a proper introduction, and then I'll talk about why I'm so crazy about Karen E. Bender. She is the author of the short story collection Refund, which was a finalist for the 2015 National Book Award. Her collection, The New Order, was on the long list for the Story Prize. She's also the author of 2 novels. Her third collection of stories, The Words of Dr. L, is now available. Her short fiction has appeared in all the best magazines, including New Yorker, Granta, is it Granta? Granta? Harvard Review, and many more. She's taught creative writing for years and has also led online workshops. I'll add, she's also, as you will see, a passionate advocate for writers, students, and humanity with a capital H. That should suffice to show you why I'm delighted. But Karen, it's always an absolute joy to talk with you. And what better occasion than to celebrate this remarkable new collection?
Thank you, Sean. It's always a joy to talk to you. You're such an advocate and champion of the arts and wonderful writer yourself. So I just think I'm I'm honored. So yay.
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, look, for me, and I've said this before, the different hats I wear, most of it is very selfish. Like to be in the writing world, to talk to writers that inspire and inform me, that's a labor of love. And we're fortunate if we're able to find things that kind of fulfill us and nourish us. But I
True.
want to be very clear that I am a better writer for having known you. And
Oh.
look, first question, like, congrats. Um, how has the journey been thus far from conception to publication and promotion? And we'll get into all the nitty gritty, but how are you doing, generally speaking, especially as it relates to the book?
Yeah, so this book started probably around 2018 after I finished The New Order, and I was trying to think I enjoyed, I just love the opportunity to write story collections, and Counterpoint has given me the opportunity to publish them, which is just a great piece of luck. And so I I think I'd started another novel, and I just felt like I wasn't really knowing what I was going to do. And what I often do is I write short stories as a way of avoiding a novel. And so I started writing these stories. And I also, one thing I'd started in the New Order is I had started some speculative stories that were really fun. And I'd done that really in response. I had started as a realist writer, and then some of my stuff got a little bit stranger as I developed. And then I had a couple stories in that were more kind of playful in that way. And people seemed to say, okay, it's all right. And so I thought, I'm just going to try more of this. And so I started with a variety. I'm trying to think which story. I might have started with the story, The Words of Dr. L. And and it just was fun to play and with these other worlds and forms. And so then basically wasn't sure what the theme was, as I never am, but I just kind of developed the different stories. And then after a while it was like, okay, actually these stories are about a couple different things. One is politics in a way. Some of them are speaking to sort of issues that the country's dealing with, like reproductive rights and climate change, and economic inequality. And then the other thing is parents and children separating at different points of life, which actually I was dealing with in many things in my own life. So those were the themes.
So thank you for that. That tees up a million questions that I have, but I think it's worthwhile to kind of point out, and I've said this to many different writers on this podcast, but I hope people watching that just is both encouraging and it's inspiring that of course, there are projects that start out and you know the beginning,
Yeah.
the middle, and the end, and you try to achieve it. But there's something so refreshing and honest about what you're describing, which is, obviously being impacted and influenced, in literal and figurative ways by the events of one's life and one's world.
Mhm.
But I find it, again, I have to say the word refreshing, like for the fourth time, but that you didn't know. I mean, you were getting the writing done, so that's its own story. You were starting to see things congeal, which can speak to how the mind starts to associate. But I guess I like the idea. Although of course I have no problem with books that are very message driven. But despite having said all that, having read the collection and having read your other work, it's so clear to me. Um, and again, I mean, what will we say in 10 years? I actually think these stories are going to age very well in terms of being touchstones of the time. But it's so clear to me that these are reflective of kind of our socio-political. But I want to add, I don't mean that because I could see how that's almost a backhanded compliment, like you're responding to this administration. You are doing it in such a subtle way, but it's an unmistakable kind of response, which
Mhm.
I think one of the things I think when I think about this book is why that matters to me as a reader.
Mm.
I think we could talk all day about what is political writing and when is it appropriate, when isn't it? I think the answer is always, never, whatever. But I think work that is going to sustain itself isn't deliberately political, or the author gets out of the way so that
Mhm.
there's at least enough room for nuance.
Mhm.
There's enough room to allow oxygen for reflection and maybe enlarge the stories. Maybe that's the point I'm trying to make. That if a story telegraphs its point, from a very left perspective,
Mhm.
what are you telling the story for? But allowing it to actually, probably, I bet a lot of readers are going to read these stories and bring interpretations that you might say, I didn't even think about that. But talk a little bit about that whole chicken egg of like, you clearly were, and in my opinion, should be responding to the
Yeah.
mess that the world is. And how I think in 2025, in these last years, I personally feel like it's not acceptable for any writer to say, I don't bother myself with that because I'm a writer and I get the writing done. Like, I think
Yeah.
times of ostensible peace, we can have those attitudes, but I don't feel like we can afford for artists right now to be completely aloof.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting question. I got a question at a reading about how, the role of writers in politics. And one thing I think is looking at fiction in particular, what does fiction do that, say, an op-ed does differently, right? An op-ed has a definite agenda. It's trying to tell you something and argue it. Fiction works from the inside. And I guess the idea is that you can try and change people's minds through the inside, through their feelings and perceptions and getting, showing a character dealing with an issue. And so one example of that is the words of Dr. L, which I wrote when Amy Comey Barrett was being confirmed. And I was so mad. And I just thought, I'm just calling my senators and I want to find some way to write about this in some way that feels like that fiction could grapple with this. And so the idea was that the idea is that Dr. L is a doctor who can tell words, that to women that are pregnant and then they'll have an abortion. It's like these magic words. And so they have more control, perhaps, than, because the government has banned, all abortions. And so there's two groups. And another group, which is called the protection group, is the one where they become afraid of doctoral and the words because they're afraid of how their thoughts will affect pregnancy. And it made me think about the idea that the GOP is actually trying to not only take over women's uteruses, but their minds, right? They're trying to make people into like these trad wife things, So I wanted to think about thought and choice and all those things, and that felt like a really good opportunity for fiction as opposed to, say, editorial.
Yeah, totally. And,
Yeah.
and I think it's also kind of important, at least for me, to point out that Obviously to write an effective essay or op-ed is extremely challenging, but it's
Yeah,
also it's very doable. There's a certain
yeah,
there's a structure and a flow and there's an industry standard that
mhm,
one can measure success by. Fiction,
right.
to do it well, is much harder. But I think within that difficulty
Mhm.
is where all the possibility exists, and this oxygen I referred to allow a story to breathe a little bit. And I guess I instinctively bristle when I anticipate anyone saying, yeah, 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 but you're using the P word like politics. And my personal feeling and your stories and spending time with them brought this back to me. Like everyone from Nathaniel Hawthorne to Franz Kafka
Mhm.
to one of my favorite contemporary writers, George Saunders,
Mhm.
none of them were writing work that was political, but you read it, especially in hindsight, and go, it was completely political.
Right, right.
These very different writers in very different places are all writing about the cultural insanity of the
Mhm.
times and trying to not only explore it and discuss it or critique it, you
Mhm.
already said this, but to show, and it gets into the show don't tell, which I have to do that, but show
Mhm.
how this is impacting people's lives. And I think that opens up the imagination of the reader and allows them that empathy that an
Mhm.
op-ed or a news story might immediately put people in their comfort zones of like, that's coming from that network. I don't pay attention to it, or I don't pay attention to this. But a fiction story removes all those safe spots and it might lead to some epiphanies.
Oh, totally. And I feel like fiction, any fiction that's challenging the power structure, kind of like that's set up, in terms of gender, race, class, religion, all of that. Though there are definitely these power, these power structures that exist. And anything that challenges those, I think, is political. I think things that support it are not, you know, and then that is different, you know. So I think things that kind of help a reader think a little bit of a different way or take another person's point of view, which is what the amazing role of fiction. You have access to another character's consciousness who may not be exactly like you, and that you're able to kind of understand a little bit more of what another person's life is like. So, I think that's really helpful too.
Yeah, and I'd love you to talk a little bit more. Again, I as someone that knows your writing, I'm just full of admiration for your foray into more speculative. And I think that's a loaded word. There's a lot of it out there, a lot of it,
Sure.
probably
Yeah.
like any form. There's a lot of bad stuff. I think
Right.
when it's at its best,
Mhm.
it can be even more effective for
Mhm.
some of the reasons we've talked about, but also how do you reflect insane times? It's like you kind of can't attack certain topics without being an op-ed head on. You almost have to introduce something to
Mhm.
kind of destabilize
Mhm.
the narrative and the setting. And it's just one person's opinion, but you do it very well. But more so, you do it in a way that I think is necessary. I can imagine some of these stories done more realist would be very powerful, but
Mm.
I think you're using some of these destabilizing and maybe less safe, for lack of a better cliche,
Yeah, yeah.
these forms in order to poke around and make things just a little bit more gray and enable more feeling than this, which I think that's a mistake the progressives make too, is that this is
Yeah.
this
Right.
is
Very,
usually the way to changing minds. Like that
yeah.
is a real tough barrier to get around.
Yeah. It's true. And I think it's interesting. My sister, who's a psychiatrist, said we were talking about why people can read dystopias a little more easily than sometimes realistic, like the newspaper, right? And she was saying that because it's a dystopia, it kind of distances the reader a little bit, and so it's a little easier to ingest. Like, like, and like for example, like my story Messengers, which is about this community that is built, and it built this big wall against a group that comes and tries to give them a message every year. And one of the things that unifies the community inside the wall is they don't want to hear the message. So this is purposefully, I don't tell what the message is. And people were like putting all this different stuff in it, which is fine because I could actually relate to a lot of different issues, you know. But I thought that was an interesting maybe structure for that dynamic, which I think is really a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk a bit about, for you also, like there's no question it's a challenge that you set for yourself, but
Mhm.
it's also something opened up inside you. I mean, of course I'm endlessly fascinated with when the writer is wise enough to be open
Mhm.
to whatever's going to come along, but also leaning into what feels right. So I
Mhm.
think, again, it's a happy ending in the sense that, again, in my very firm opinion, the stories are deeply effective and use the speculative aspects to their credit. But you could have resisted that impulse because it wasn't ground you had been playing in for many years. Talk a little bit about both the excitement and maybe
Right.
the trepidation and all of that.
I mean, I think a lot of it just has to do with reading. And I mean, I think part of it is my students were all writing speculative and they were, and so I was like, okay, this is interesting. And this is something that I actually should learn more about too. So that was part of it too, that I felt like there, it was a way of also helping my students. So, and then it was reading people like Margaret Atwood and Octavia Butler and Yoko Tawada and Dina Buzzati and, just so many writers that are, Samantha Schweblin. I mean, that I just were doing this work in ways that I thought were really fun and ways that I felt I could see an in for myself. I felt like I could see how to put characters in a way that felt, you know, honors the realistic and the emotional elements, but also then plays around in a world. So I think it always writing is a response to reading. So I think it was finding some of these writers and, or just, reading them again and seeing, oh, what are they doing and what could I say? What do I have to offer that I could say in this way?
And I'm glad that gives me the opportunity. I just read it like very recently, like
Mhm.
far enough that I can't remember who said it, but it was like within the last week. But it was a question about writer's block, and the question was, how do you avoid writer's block? It was a
Yeah.
one-word answer, reading, and I was like, I've never heard that response, and it's like it's so perfect. Like if you literally are sitting down, because that's usually the answer, like sit down and you'll be surprised. Fair
Yeah.
enough. But if you're sitting down and you're just unsatisfied or you've hit a block or you're tired, read. And I think that's such great advice for any writer. Like there's no excuse to not be reading and responding to the work that's gone on before us and is going on with us. But I also want to acknowledge, I think you just gave the most authentic and wonderful response to why teachers that love to teach. You
Yeah.
said some of this
Yeah.
writing was influenced by my students.
Yeah.
That's so you, but that's such a great way because I think it gets a lot of professors get really pretentious, well, I get to guide and then it comes back
Right.
in different ways, but to really credit, which is not done often enough, right? Especially with millennial
Yeah.
Gen Z, like heaven
Yeah.
forbid we learn something from these kids that are on their devices. Like I just find that whole
Yeah.
sensibility both necessary and refreshing.
Well, it's true. I mean, I think it is true. It's interaction and, they bring in work and I'll be like, oh, this is interesting. So no one has brought in yet an AI powered story. So that, thank God, because that I would have trouble with. But
Yeah.
but they do bring in all these other things and it's like they like I mean basically a writing classroom is a writing community and so you think about and one of the great things about that community is that you're sharing work, you're sharing what you're reading, and people can give each other ideas, and I love it when I tell students something and they're like, oh my God, I can't believe I haven't discovered this writer. And that's the biggest thing a teacher can do. And, just in the classroom, what the students can do for each other.
Yeah, and I've written about this a lot myself, but I feel like one of the primary impulses before I even started like publishing work was
Yeah.
this sense of paying it forward. Like these
Mhm.
musicians and writers and artists have
Yeah.
made my life so dramatically better.
Hmm.
The least I can do is
Hmm.
proselytize about their
Yeah.
work and getting it out in the world in a small way. And I think
Yeah.
obviously,
Totally.
there's enough of that going on.
Hmm.
The world is definitely a better place. And I think you and I have talked in the past. My somewhat sardonic observation is that there isn't enough of that going on. I think there's a lot of reasons for it.
Yeah.
People are very beat down, they're very under pressure, and everyone's got to hustle.
Right.
But I think if a lot of writers that are feeling angst took a deep breath and said, you know what I could do today? I could
Mhm.
lift up another writer, and they
Mhm.
might be surprised
Mhm.
uh, how much better that makes them feel. Not in a karmic,
Right.
like, and then they'll throw it back to me, but just there are ways out of some of the heaviness and despair, and some of it is celebrating.
I think that's true. Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll go there. You brought up the AI word. I, if we had talked a year ago, I think I would have had a different take. I want to run this by you and come at me with both barrels if it's too blasé. But Karen, I've been over the last year, as it relates to society and employment, AI is horrifying. There's a lot we've got to be
Right.
wary about and
Ah,
learn. But as it relates to art and writing in particular, I'm less concerned than ever, only because the more ubiquitous this hacking system of like, oh, I could just write a story in 3 seconds, people are going to want the authenticity that maybe they forgot was so
right.
important. And having all this crap force fed into the discourse, I
Mhm,
just think it's going to ultimately be for serious writing. I
mhm,
think as a culture, we're going to have to concede like this
mhm.
can't be done easily. We could do
I agree with
easier,
that. Yeah.
but yeah, talk to
I
me.
think,
But I also I'm not teaching creative writing right now, so I'm taking 2 steps back and saying easier said than done. But I just mean kind of philosophically, like I'm
yeah.
not worried. Like, are people even going to read books anymore? My opinion is yes, very much so.
I agree with that. I do feel like, now we need to put, don't use AI. I have like an AI statement now in my syllabus. I
Yeah.
mean, the thing that is really disturbing as a writer is how they've stolen everyone's books, including mine, and so I just joined this lawsuit. There's this lawsuit against something called Anthropic, which is, and it's through it, and the Authors Guild sent around a link, for writers, just, and they say, we're going to sue them. And I just saw an article that said hopefully they could destroy this. I mean, like, because it's just so gross that they just took everyone's book, you
Yeah.
know, without permission, just, sort of used it. So that is also chilling. Yeah.
It's totally chilling, and
Yeah.
that tees up, another area. I want to come back to your book. I've got some specific
Oh, yeah.
questions, but while that's simmering on the front burner, we absolutely can't and shouldn't overlook that this hopefully can be some of these cultural, political,
Yeah.
technological developments can galvanize artists and academics, but
Mhm.
that is not to kind of overlook the fact something you and I know both are deeply concerned about and kind of active in, which is resistance,
Mhm.
spreading awareness, and at least taking advantage of one's modest platform
Mhm.
to through words and deeds say I'm not going to go hide.
Right.
I'm
Right.
not brave enough to be on the front lines. I don't know if I'm doing anything meaningful, but we are in a times where the arts and academia are under
Yeah.
absolute assault.
Right.
uh,
Right.
Talk a little bit about how you're navigating. I know that's a real loaded question, but just high level as a writer teacher, and how are some of these pressures either concerning and exhausting you and or inspiring and kind of
Yeah.
invigorating? I bet it's a bit of both.
Well, I mean, it's a great question. So I know this last semester when I was teaching, um, you know, I was, I wanted the classroom to be a safe space for people to write whatever. And, you know, one of my, some of my students said, this stuff that I'm writing would be banned, because of its explicit nature, or, the LGBTQ, there's a lot of stuff that's in workshops that could be banned, um, which is insane, which is just insane and vile,
Totally insane.
and um, so I just was like, this is important. We're doing important work. And so basically, it felt like the workshop was actually a distraction. Whenever I was in workshop, I didn't think about everything that was going on.
Yeah.
I was just focused on the student work, and we all talked about it, and it was really helpful. And every time I teach, whether it's like a 2-hour Zoom class, or going to the, I went to the Iowa Festival a few weeks ago and taught, wherever it is, it feels like the workshop feels like a sacred space right now. and I am running it how I want, and so I think that is helpful. Um, and there also is the fact that, the literary, and readings are helpful.
Yeah,
And going to readings and have seeing people talk about work in ways that feel really um, nourishing. So I think all that's really I feel like I see writing as just like a safe space to be in the workshop, now because it's so and I felt that with my readings that I did for the words of Dr. L.
right.
So it's interesting. One thing I do now, I started with empty nest, there's like some more time, a little more time, and I started taking cello lessons, which I took taken when I was in high school. And so I'm not very good, but it's just like really fun to try this other art form. And when
Yeah,
I mean that too, it just feels like this safe space. And I think it's really important to have artistic safe spaces in this time. At the same time, then you also, I feel like, need to be doing things, calling your representatives or going to protests, donating to places, whatever you can do is critical because if you have a voice, if you have a little time, if you've, you know, it is important to say this is not good. You're against all of the horrors.
right,
I think
right.
it's really crucial, and some writers doing it more than others.
Yeah.
But I feel like it's important. Yes.
Not only is it important, I mean, I think it's increasingly kind of heroic when we've seen these profiles in
Oh,
cowardice that
yeah, right.
some of the biggest universities
Oh,
obeying in advance. Again,
mhm,
I mean, taking the long view, assuming we have the luxury of a long view in
right,
American, culture, but
right,
I do think these are going to become the history lessons of look who acquiesced right
right.
away
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
look who didn't stand up. And invariably it's those with the most, those with the most cushy and secure platforms that are wary of having the boat rocked. And where I'm still finding hope is as it relates to the humanities, but also just academia writ large, is the administration does have the power of the law behind them, but we see time and again this is bullying. It's meant to intimidate. It's meant to unsettle, and I don't see. I think the blowback to this, politically, but also just kind of culturally, is that people are going to remember no one's being indoctrinated at colleges. People are going there to learn. People are actually, ironically, going there to have and I'm doing it ironically, but a safe space to argue, to debate.
Right, right.
Feel like
Totally.
their life and death issues aren't on the table. This is an opportunity for minds to grow. And I think people like you and I that are a little bit older and have taught understand like, yeah, that's exactly what they're trying to squelch. They're going to dress it up in DEI and all this
Right.
other nonsense. But that's what I think the reactionaries in our culture have always been uneasy about and trying to marginalize.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it makes a diverse curriculum even more important, right? And that, you want to teach a variety of writers and talk about, all the different ways, people experience the world. And, I mean, that feels even more important. And I feel like a lot of what the administration does actually is against the law. A lot is actually illegal, right? And that the courts have to stop it, so yeah, no, it's exhausting and it's like a balancing act between protecting your own sanity and trying to remain calm,
Yes.
and also um I know Robert, my husband Robert and I, before we go to sleep, we would, be watching the news and then we couldn't sleep. So we're like, okay, we have to stop doing that before we go to sleep. Instead, we were watching all of Seinfeld, which actually which is an amazing show. And we went to sleep. So I think, I mean,
Yeah.
that's, you know, fortunate, right, I mean that we could, but I also think you've got to find ways to protect your mental space so that you can do things to resist and to speak out and to do all these actions, whatever they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you and I are both fond of, and I think well, I know we walk the walk, but when we talk about things like community,
Mhm.
that's it in a nutshell, right? The having the community, belonging to a community, cultivating, nourishing a community
Right.
is a
right.
way to find that courage, that solidarity,
Oh
and
yeah, and
the
and
energy to go back
actions.
into battle. Because we
Yeah.
all shouldn't feel as artists or teachers or citizens that it's all on our shoulders. But I think again, the way the media hellscape is set up is it is to put these pressures directly on everyone's, forehead and make them feel like you can't do anything about it. And
Oh yeah, no, community is key. And I mean, another thing I did is, we joined a temple near us, and they have a refugee task force, which is really effective and has all these things you can do. So I joined that, and I'm doing some stuff with them. And it just like little things you can do locally through organizations that already exist is really helpful, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned Iowa.
Yeah.
Like with AI, I'll go there.
Yeah.
To me, there have been, some tiny tremors. There's been some predictable storms as it relates to academia and funding. But the recent announcement of the Iowa Summer Festival and writing,
Mhm.
talk a little bit about that. That was a shock. I would say when
Yeah.
I read that and then saw your response to it, which I'd love you to talk a little bit about. But that's when that's one of those moments where we are definitely things are escalating and there's
Oh yeah,
very
no, I mean that was horrible. So the Iowa Summer Writing Fest, so the University of Iowa is known for being a writer center of the world. In fact, Iowa City is a UNESCO City of Literature, one of three in North America and one of 35 in the world.
yep,
And that's partly because of the workshop, which is, this, long-standing, place where, it's like one of the first, MFA programs.
yep,
And then other things in the city, the Iowa International Writing Program is one. There's also the Summer Writing Festival, which has been going on for, I think, 35 years. And, has been something I think we started teaching there around 2008, on and off. For first, we would drive there from Wilmington with our kids, and then once with Robert's mother. And we taught for a couple weeks, and it was this wonderful community run by Amy Margolis, who's just an amazing leader, visionary. And it was just students that come from all over. It also really served the Midwest. We did, I was there, some other times, and then they had a really amazing online program that started during COVID when they had shut down the in-person. And our online classes, when they first offered them, it was like, it must have been 2020, I think it was April, they closed in 2 minutes because people were so desperate to take a writing class. So we'd have writing classes there, and I have students from all over the world. They would get up at 3 in the morning in India to take the classes. They were like,
right.
once I had one woman in Paris, another Ivory Coast, and they started talking in French. It was just like incredible. And these
Amazing.
communities happened online. So the festival had started again in person a couple of years ago, and this year, we went. And then 2 weeks after we taught it a couple of weeks ago, we got this email that said, we're sad to say we're closing the festival, and that, it's because of the budget. And if you have fond memories of the festival, please write to this address. And also you can send feedback to this dean. So like I immediately, it was like memories, like, are you kidding? Like everyone was shocked. Everyone was shocked. And they just fired the entire staff, which was horrible.
Yeah.
It was a very successful festival we had just been to. And so why? Okay, so why? So they say it's budget, but the regents of Iowa, are very conservative. And recently, another thing that happened at Iowa is two employees who were secretly videoed saying something of that they want to use synonyms for DEI to talk about DEI. And so they so they were like suspended or put on leave or something because they use word like belonging. I mean, which is like Stalinist insanity, right? So a lot of people, what's painful is seeing how this university, which is known for writing, should be supporting writing, is now basically owned by these conservative legislature and regents who are not supporting it. And something that could be really great economically, that is important economically to the town, And so they're going to see if I don't know what's going to happen. But I mean, that was chilling to me. That was actually that was the thing that has, in terms of personal stuff that affects, that was the most personal thing that affected me as in terms of this mega stuff.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing that, Karen. I mean, we could go down that rabbit hole and talk for a long time about what that exemplifies and just the ludicrousness of it. But one of the things that makes me think about is, first of all, and we were talking about this a little bit before we came on the air, which is usually when a more conservative opinion is castigating the arts and funding for the arts, one of the go-tos is like, this is taxpayer money, and that organization couldn't exist otherwise. I think it's very helpful to point out this is the rare or semi-rare artistic endeavor that's hugely successful, that is not only not a strain economically, is arguably a boon. And my advice, to anyone, and I don't mean you and the people directly involved, but I would love to see more like progressive writers and academics try to fight on that playing field, because going to appeals of the heart, that gets into like PBS levels of like in one ear and out the other. But attacking the stupidity of this by saying this is bringing revenue to the town, it's bringing tourists, it's good PR, which
Right.
leads to the one conclusion that I think we would agree on is, oh, it's very deliberate. It has nothing to do with economics. And in fact, it's one of these to instill a sense of fear and trepidation. And it has nothing to do with a logical business case, which flies in the face of conservative ideology. So we need to
Well,
kind of,
I think I think I don't know exactly what the budget issues were, but I think the idea is all these universities are dealing with budgets they have to juggle, but why are they choosing this to then cut, right?
right.
Why are they not looking to the football coach to trim his salary a tiny bit or something like that? It just is, they want, because they're hostile to the arts.
Yeah,
And that's just strange. It's strange because the arts really are, a gem of Iowa, so.
totally.
But the thing that was surprising to me is like this is not serving the constituents, because people there were a lot of people that had driven there from other small Iowa towns, and they were so glad to have a community of writers. You
Yeah.
know, I mean I think that is one thing about a writing community is it's actually sometimes you say it's also about loneliness, right? People gather in these festivals or classes because they're the only one person they know who's a writer, or because they are a writer and other people don't understand it. And how relieved they are to be a part of a community and why these communities are therefore so important.
Yeah, and watching you in action, which is always very inspiring to me, is I think a good antidote to what many of us would agree on is like, yeah, social media, these devices, just the plethora of info overload. There are some real deleterious effects on society. However, at times like this, 20 years ago, if something like this was happening, I think people would feel even more isolated and alone.
That's
It's
true.
nice. It's nice to see micro communities of the arts and academics and progressives rallying and offering support to each other. I think
True.
without action, it can be a lot of very safe kind of, I did my part. You've got to kind of try to do something to affect change or support the organizations that are left standing. But I do take some solace in seeing what seems to be an almost unanimous
Right.
outcry. And
Yeah.
again, some of that, right, I think is going to fuel the other side because they love the impotence of our protests. But the protests are more important. It's better than acquiescence. So
Well, I do think also protests can also lead to other alternatives.
yeah,
It's like you think, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen, but I think, you think if a university is not going to fund it, then who will?
yeah,
So then you think, what are other ways that these arts organizations can flourish? And that's where like, where billionaires, where are you? You can help. These are ways you can help. And maybe there are other ways to create these structures.
yeah.
But it's sad because you think universities should be the place where it is.
And I think they can be, they should be.
Can be, they can be.
My kind of recalcitrant stance is that I do think we can win some hearts and minds back, but
Yeah.
the ones that do the most writing need to tell better stories and tie some of this into why it's good for a culture, why it's good for society, why it's good economically.
Mhm.
Um, and maybe that leads to a place where people begin to recognize the parents that are paying the tuition realize, gee, why has the administrative budget bloated in the last 2 decades and there's more adjuncts and there's
Oh,
less humanities classes being taught?
right.
If we're able to shift the focus on those things, that can start to affect some change. Again, I'm all about, I mean, in fact, what I do is appeal to the heart and wear my heart on my sleeve. But I think we've seen over the decades that that long game, appealing to the sense of shame and guilt is never going to work. And with a Twitter, attention span, there's
Right.
ready-made talking points, whether it's about immigrants, academia, or the arts,
Right.
that people can latch onto. So I think it's up to us to tell better stories, but also maybe take the battle to some of these folks in effective ways, that are not just all about like, let me tell you how upset I am about this. More of that, please. But let's
Yeah.
have some more kind of systematic pushback that actually might use the power of rhetoric to advance the cause.
I mean, I do also think it's about values of the culture, which is we have a culture where the main value is profit, as opposed to anything else, as opposed to like, understanding or connection. If that the fact that that is a structure and that affects us all actually in psychological ways, I think we're not aware of, the capitalist structure and the idea that you have to make more and more money and that those are values as opposed to like helping each other or creating something beautiful that may not make money.
Yeah.
That's, I think, a really big thing that we're not aware of.
Totally. And second time today, you've triggered something I recently read, and I've read this anecdote before, and I love it. Apparently, Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller were at a
Oh,
cocktail party,
I've
and
heard that. Yeah.
Vonnegut pulls him aside and says, "That billionaire hedge fund manager is going to make more tomorrow than you're going to make in your whole career." And Heller says, "I got
No,
something that he'll never have." Vonnegut says, "What?" He says, "Enough."
I know. That's a great
That's
story.
what our artists can, that's what our artists can remind us and tell us, and more artists as heroes and role models.
Mhm.
Again, I think that there's a certain party and collection of people that are very aware of that and afraid of that,
Yeah,
and
of
don't
course
want
they're
those
afraid of it,
minds.
right? Because it undermines their power structure.
Yeah.
It could undermine it. So I think that is why I think writing is especially important. I do have students who say, "Oh, how can I write now?" It's like, yes, it's really important to write now. And it's
Yeah.
also important to do other stuff. It's important to protest and stuff, whatever, however you can. But it is also important to write.
Yes, which thank you for that on a platter. That brings me back to why write? How can writing be done well? Funny I should ask that rhetorical question. So I am allowed to say whatever I want because it's my podcast. So selfishly, I will take this opportunity to once again say from the rooftops, the whole book is a smashing success. However, I wanted to talk to you a little bit, if you're okay, with a particular story that I had the good fortune of having been your friend. I think I read online before I read in the book and have since revisited it. The Extra Child.
Oh.
Yeah, so we can talk a little bit about what it is and how it came about.
Yeah.
But to me, when I'm getting goosebumps just saying this, we could people like us can talk craft all day, and I'm never get enough of it. But what I ultimately love whenever I'm talking about the best art is it ultimately leads you to this place where you just kind of have to say, I can't even explain it. It's just it's there, and that's the magic of what the reader brings to it. And if the reader knows anything about the writer, maybe that helps or doesn't help. But knowing you, knowing that you've been shifting into empty nest, I'm just so curious. Like, does a story like that, did that come to you in a flash? Did it, I can imagine that there was a germ or a flash of inspiration, and maybe you followed that like we do with a story. But
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't remember the moment I thought of it, but I think I did think about the idea of, we had, recently our daughter had gone off to school and so we were kind of like what is, now what, and there's this feeling of like, I was just like, well, what if there was like a third one that suddenly showed up? And the one really, one book I think that inspired me on this is this children's book. It's a picture book called Zagazoo, which I don't remember the author of it, but it's a fantastic picture book that I recommend. And it's basically about, it's about this couple and they sort of find a baby and they start tossing the baby to each other. And the baby at first is like a little vulture screaming all night. And then the baby becomes like a little elephant knocking everything around. And then the baby becomes like the scary gorilla that scares the parents. And then the baby turns into a nice young man who makes them dinner. And then the parents are pelicans. And it's like this crazy, like, look at the life cycle. And it's just a brilliant book.
Yeah.
And I think I like the idea of transformation in that. And I like the idea of the child transforming, kind of quickly. The third one, it's like a sort of kind of fast paced, raising him.
Yeah.
But the idea of that you have this longing to nurture something, and then what do you do with it?
Right.
Yeah.
And then when I think that crosses over to craft, right, is it begs all kinds of questions like our subconscious is always busy. We
Right.
are the sum of all of our experiences and emotions and feelings. And
Yeah.
who knows what on a given day is going to churn up either a memory or a longing or a regret and how that can be transformed. Like, I guess what I'm saying is it's very presumptuous of me to have you here and talk about your story, but I'm imagining even as you were writing that, I don't sense that you had plotted that out. Like there's enough room in there,
Yeah.
even I would imagine as the author, like I'm talking about some universal stuff here, but
Right.
it's amorphous enough where it could be very literal or it could be a metaphor, but it could be a lot of other things. It could be guilt, all of that. I just
Oh,
want to like just
yeah.
acknowledge. I mean, again, I could pick a number of stories, but that one I keep coming back to. I think that's a story that
Oh,
I'll
good.
certainly revisit and teach and talk about because I think it gets at and again, with full respect to you, any of your short fiction that I've read can ably do this, but this one, as well as any other,
Mm.
gets to that beautiful space where it's like, what is the power of the short story, like as opposed to an op-ed or a novel? And
Mm.
some of it is this, you have the opportunity to not necessarily tidily conclude, or it can start in media res, like all of that stuff somehow can actually be compressed into something small that goes so much bigger.
Yeah, totally. No, I think that's true. I mean, I think the thing is, um, I feel like good stories are also sort of like dreams, like, and we all basically, I was thinking we all are storytellers when we sleep. We all create stories when we dream, whatever the kind of stories are, and, maybe not really plotted, but, they're images. And I guess the idea is that felt like I feel like when a story is on, then it mimics the sort of strange logic of a dream. And so that's what I feel like that story hopefully was doing.
It totally did. And I just will encourage everyone to, well, get the book and read it. But
Yeah. Thank you.
there's a recurring thing where the mother's talking to one of the kids at school and says, "Okay, here's exactly what you need to do. The line was dead." Like, so is so perfect. Like the chef's kiss. Like, there's nothing better than a book that makes you shout out when you're alone reading it. Just
Oh, that's
enjoy.
amazing. Oh, Sean, thank you.
And I'm sure that there, on some level, that is all. That also is not a metaphor.
Well, I mean, our kids don't hang up on us, which is nice.
Right, right.
But I mean, we're always trying to give them advice.
Okay, here's exactly what you need to do. I
Right.
mean, even as
And
a
then it's
husband,
like,
right? Like, I don't need you to solve it. I just need you to listen. There's, yeah, I think that gets at the other thing, which I think we've gradually brought out through this discussion. But, um, when Karen, whether I'm reading poetry or fiction, it's not really a deep observation, but if there's kind of the absence of vulnerability and humanity,
right,
I just have less time for that. I don't think I ever had a lot of time for it, which
right,
again is not to say I can't and don't read books that aren't politically engaged. In fact, in my own, hypocrisy, I prescribe to the Orwell, like anyone that says there should be no politics in art, that's a self-political statement. That being said, there's ways to do it. So I'm not saying that the work has to be humanistic, but when you read work by people that you know have lived a life and they're not kind of either lucky or unlucky enough to be sequestered like in privilege or an environment that doesn't ensure that they're interacting with people, it's just so obvious to me that these works are written by a mother and a teacher and someone that lives and thrives in New York City. Like it
It's
shouldn't have
humble.
anything to do with the success of the story, and I agree it doesn't, but it's so obvious that these are coming from someone that has lived deeply and cares deeply. How
Yeah.
insane is that observation?
How insane is
Yeah, I
that?
mean, are you feeling that, or is that a little over the top?
I mean, I think, you know, I don't know any writers that are able to be sequestered and not do anything personally. Everyone I know has to juggle something.
Yeah,
So everyone is living in, I mean, I just feel like, it's what I do,
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, actually, that brings up a fantastic question that I always like to ask, which is when I talk to younger people and they lament what seems to be a ever shrinking kind of vista for people in the arts, I
Yeah.
remind them in a very encouraging way, like it's always been thus. It's just more so
Right.
now, but
Right.
there's never really been a safe space where someone says, okay, took me a few years post graduation, but I want to be a writer and now I'm going to go for it. The
Right.
reality for so many of us is that whether we want to call them sacrifices or compromises or just the reality of balancing a life, I've leaned a little more into reminding people, in my own opinion, having a day job, however dry and antithetical to the arts, in some ways can be the best thing. Only because if you know where your paycheck's coming from and you've got benefits, it actually will free up a part of your mind that might otherwise be
Yeah.
constantly, making art, worrying about life. So I don't know where I'm going with that other than to say I think I'm glad you pointed out that you don't know any writers that aren't having to be part of the world. And I just think if that wasn't already the new normal, it certainly is likely to be. And I think we all, as writers, should both demystify that, but also say there's opportunity there. It's not, I don't see it as doors closing so much as there are ways to navigate the new normal. And I think there's windows for opportunity and optimism there.
Yes, and I mean, I think because looking back, I look back at, me moving to New York in the 1980s and then actually after Iowa in the 1990s and getting an apartment. And I had an apartment that was, it was like a grant. It was like 300 a month in Williamsburg. I mean, and it was a cute apartment, and that allowed me to maybe not work as much so I could write. And I think it is harder for artists now because things are so expensive, literally everywhere, so it's hard. And I think part of art and being an artist is time, and how do you find a job that will allow you that time or mind space too? So I think it is harder actually for writers now. But in some ways, it's interesting. But I think too, I look at, like in my career, there was a moment when I think one of my books was going around and everyone was like, oh my God, there are these new things called ebooks. Everything is going to collapse, and it was like, but it didn't, so I think,
Yeah.
yes, there are definitely, but I think financially it's really hard. There's this wonderful new book by Peter Trachtenberg called Twilight of Bohemia, which is about Westbeth. And Westbeth was a subsidized artist uh, housing in New York. And it
Uh,
was like, where writers and all these different artists could live for low rents and just do their art, which is kind of, amazing and revolutionary. And, it hasn't happened since. And, it's, you just think like those values, like, well, can New York become, something where it can be more affordable, hopefully with Mom Donnie, or something, that maybe New York can be, I mean, it is now a lot of, playground for the wealthy. I mean, there's a lot of, most people are not, but I think
right.
there's a lot, I mean, housing is insane, so I think it is something that is hard, it's harder for writers financially, I think now.
Yeah, that's totally fair. I mean, I guess I would just gently
Yeah,
say it's harder for everyone whether they're writing or not. But
that's true.
your point is well taken.
Yeah,
Um, I think
yeah,
I'm coming from a place more of I don't want younger aspiring artists to feel intimidated or that the future shut off to them.
yeah. No, no, definitely not. I
Like
mean, there's always
it's
room
always
for,
been a hustle.
yeah, there's always room for good work.
Yeah.
There's always room for good. I mean, you know, people are reading new writers all the time, and they'll sell books and all these things. So I think there are all these ways you can find a place as a writer.
Yeah. For sure.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
having a few billionaires remember that at least 100 years ago, the robber barons, just for appearances, built libraries and established institutions. Hey guys, gals, remember, throw some money around just even to make yourself feel better. That's
Right.
topic for another day. But before I let you go, you had mentioned when you started this book, you were working on a novel. I
Oh
have to
no.
ask, where are you at right now? I mean, if you deserve and earn a break, but are you in kind of a short story headspace, or
I
where
mean,
are you at as it relates to like what you're gonna maybe be working on next?
yeah, I mean, I think, I just finished sort of doing readings for this, so I feel like, I mean, I think I have a couple different projects that are not, they're a little different. I mean, one is maybe a craft book. I'm thinking it would be really interesting to kind of write a craft book, see if that can work, because that would be fun, which is more about teaching. And
Mhm.
then, I'm thinking, I mean, I feel like we'll see. I feel like I don't want to say what I'm working on because it always changes.
Well, and I also, I read when I was a very young writer, I think it was Hemingway, but someone had very strong opinions about never talk about a work in progress because you'll kill it. And I totally believe that. I feel like kind of the energy that you're putting into that hope and expectation
Mm,
by talking about it, you're satisfying something maybe deeper inside that can only be satisfied by doing it.
that's
So, and you never want to be precious about your own work, but I really do think there's something to be said about keeping one's powder dry while there are things percolating because
right,
you need
right, right.
that
You never know what's the
you need
next.
to live with it for a while before it's ready for public consumption.
Right, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Good point.
Um, well, Karen, I mean, as always, an hour flies by, but my only goal today, in addition to just getting some time with you, I think mission accomplished. I wanted to hear what you're working on, get your thoughts on current events, but beginning and end, we are here to celebrate the words of Dr. L. I will put myriad links and so forth. But while people are watching and hearing, Karen, how can people easily discover you and find you and check you out?
Oh, well, I mean, my website is www. Should I put in the chat? Would that be helpful?
No, it won't show up.
Oh, okay. So my website is www.karenebender.com, and there I'll put, like, if I'm doing readings, and also I do a lot of Zoom. I mean, I teach various places, but one place, I teach Zoom classes for a place called Writing Workshops, and I'll list my classes there. And then, and I am doing private classes with my husband, Robert Siegel, as well. We just started doing that, which is very fun. And so, um, yeah, so I mean, you can see kind of that, any information about the book, and then you can get it, you can get it anywhere. You should, any books, if you don't see it at your bookstore, you can order it or get it at bookshop.com or.
Yay. Well, that's what I was hoping you would talk about your website, but also it was a subtle nudge because you're probably too modest. Folks, did you catch that? Zoom and possibly private consultations
Yeah.
with this person? What are you waiting for? Go check it out. Karen, I never say this like every day is a blessing, but certain things you can predict. We will meet again.
Oh,
So we
thanks.
will talk again, but every time is really an honor. Just thank you for this book and thank you for doing all the things you do. I think everyone, it's very clear why I admire you so much, but you really are a force for good in and outside the art world. So thank you for doing the things you do. It really matters.
Thank you, Sean. I'm just such a joy talking to you as always. And thank you for all you do for the arts.
My
So
heart is pitter pattering. All right, guys, we'll see you soon. Thanks for checking out Some Things Considered. Drop me a line if you want to be a guest or know someone who I should be talking to. Be safe, stay sane, and we'll see you soon. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.